thought need to be corrected by developing, first of all, a working method, deliberation as a working method of a major institution of citizens' representation here in the European Parliament, empowering citizens. Second, building the Europolis means also building infrastructures for holding accountable sovereign nation states on the one hand and autonomous non-elected bodies. And third, deliberative consensus conferences with stakeholders in program countries, for example, holding here hearings with stakeholders in socio-economic policies might be a method for reconciling the divide between social and economic Europe. Thank you very much. Sorry for the...
Thank you very much. I think it was very, very interesting, and thank you very much for the offer. Now I would like to give the floor for our next speaker, Dr. Andreas Gross, who is a member of the Swiss Parliament and, of course, chairperson of the Socialist and Democratic Group in the Council of Europe, and, of course, he's a colleague of mine, which I'm very proud. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I have to do something in 15 minutes, which is nearly not impossible because I heard so many misunderstandings of direct democracy. So I hope it's just an introduction for another debate. Pardon?
You can get 20 because you can...
No, that's okay. It's okay. I want to start by making a contribution to the overcoming of, I think, what you can say a banalization of the terms. And this is also a possibility to precise some notions, because sometimes you have the impression that you are in a new Orwellian time where everybody uses the same language, but everybody understands it differently and nobody so has a possibility to understand. And I think it's very important that we try to be more precise, and for me the source of definition, so to say the criteria and towards which you have to measure and you have to think the reality are the standards developed after the French Revolution. And when you look at these standards, you see that democracy should be much more than a choice. Democracy should enable the people to be free. But then you have to also understand what is freedom. Freedom is much more than just a choice between Pepsi or Coca-Cola. Freedom is the right, the ability and the opportunity to create, together with others, your common life base. That, as it was said, life should not be a destiny. And think about how many people today understand democracy, understand politics in which they live as a chance not to live the life as a destiny. I think very few. And one of the problems is that democracy is limited to the nation state, although the real influences of the daily life are today coming from transnational structures. And because democracy is also a substantial promise. Additionally to the third point, it's also a substantial promise that you have a fair distribution of the life chances. But the nation state can't provide any more contribution, can't make any more contribution to the fair distribution of life chances. That's why we have a depowerment of the whole political structures. The nation state loses autonomy, but there is no compensation on the democratic side when it comes to the transnational level. There you have, so to say, a hegemony of economic forces without any force of democratic legitimate forces to balance, so to say, to enforce a balance between the different needs and the different interests, and also the needs of the poor, the needs of those who can't express themselves on the markets, with economic forces. In this sense, I also would like to say that there is a notion of violence which is much broader than the normal classical notion of violence, because democracy should constitute the rules, the rights and the procedures in order to make conflicts solvable without any violence. And there is another notion we have to defend: conflicts. The reduction of conflict to violence is a huge misleading error, because conflicts are in fact the media of social learning. You need to have conflicts to enable us to learn, but therefore you have to have procedures and rules which does not tend to violence but to understanding. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, and which is also then in this logic, citizens, in the French term of citoyen, on the contrary to the bourgeois, a distinction we don't have even in English or in German, is exactly the citizens who take up this notion of democracy. That's an invitation to be free together with others, to influence your own basic common life base, so to say. And when it comes now to direct democracy, perhaps I can do this with the next slide. Democracy is always, and I think this was said already this morning, we don't want to replace representation, but direct democracy is an additional element to the representation, which prevents democracy, which prevents the representation to become the monopole. But direct democracy, and this is an addition to this point, is about issues and not about persons. Because the logic of the decision-making and the deliberation on issues is totally different than the logic of choosing between persons. That's why, for instance, the idea to directly elect the President of the Commission or anybody else has nothing to do with direct democracy. It's another way of enlarging representation, perhaps, or enlarging the field of election, but it has nothing to do with direct democracy. I can go into the deeper point when you would like to discuss about this, and this is especially also to Mr. Brons. The referendum is a totally different thing than a plebiscite. In a direct democracy, it's always a part of the people who have the right to make all people invited to decide. Never ever the government is free just to choose a question and then put this question to the people. This is exactly what we say plebiscite in the tradition of Napoleon III in the middle of the 19th century, and it was always used by dictators to get the legitimacy they didn't have out of parliaments, but it has nothing to do with direct democracy. And the central point, and in this sense you can say direct democracy is a contribution to the democratization of democracy, knowing that's an ongoing, never-ending process. You never will have perfect democracies, but you can always have a start in making this democratization process. And the point perhaps which is the most convincing on one side, but also the most difficult, shows that today I have the impression that on the political side, on the polity side, we have a framework which does not allow the societies to exploit the potentials they have in their societies. Citizens, people, they feel underestimated by politics. When you look from the individual, when you look from the system, you can say today's way of the design of politics, this reduction to the nation state, this reduction to the representation, the empowerment of the non-elected bodies, as my predecessor said, this shows the under-organisation of the society in order to realise the potentials which are in the society. And this is one of the sources of the frustration and why so many people turn their back to our way of making politics. Now, when I start with this one, I could also start now with the design element. But the core question of what you get out of the direct democracy is how you design it. Already Mr. Schiller said that, many others in this morning. A badly designed direct democracy is worse than nothing. Especially, you also discredit, so to say, the processes when you make them so badly as they are done in some of the countries, some of the regions. But when you design it in a way that people are able to express themselves, then you get exactly what the European Union misses most today. That's perhaps the center point I would like to defend. And I enumerated some of the elements. Legitimacy is of course clear, and I would also say that in a time you have so many problems with the output, you would like to have a little bit more input. But the second point perhaps is more surprising. But when you invite people, citizens, to participate, they feel themselves as a part of a bigger thing. Then you get also the identification, but you get also the integration from their diversity. And the best way to put that is what Mr. Dürrenmatt, one of the two big writers in Switzerland of the 20th century, he said the Swiss, who are very, as Gerald already said this morning, very different. They have no common history, no common language, no common destiny, no common religion, no common many. The only thing we have in common that we are different. Dürrenmatt said the nicest way, and that's why they like to be together, the Swiss, although they are so different, is that they are allowed every 4 months to discuss their differences. And the decisions are made in respect of these differences, and letting people participate in this decision-making process make them stay together, because the diversity is respected, and you always get a timely, limited unity, but everybody is allowed to put this unity or this consensus decision in a further time on another level. By inviting the people to participate, you get an enormous increase of discussion, of communication. Communication is, so to say, the soul of direct democracy. And in this sense, you create public spheres. Not one, but thousands, hundreds of thousands. Wherever people meet, they discuss, and other people listen and get involved. And this is the biggest difference between discussing about issues and choosing about people. You get an issue-based discourses, because the logic of an issue-based discourse is different to the personal choice. This was already said in the 19th century by the movement who fought for direct democracy in Switzerland in a time where you didn't have any photographs, you have no television, of course, no cinema, no public relations, spin doctors. But already then they said the most difficult issue is easier to understand than a person, because in a person you never know after the elections if he sticks to what he said before. And in this sense, you get a less personalized discussion and a much more issue-based, where the logic is easier to understand and to discuss. The other element, which is also a contribution to the clarification of the notions, you create, in the first I said, you get what you miss most, but you create also what you need most, communities. Because communities you can't get when you don't activate the people. Identity is a result of a common action, a common engagement. Passively, you lose your identity. That's why communities, when you have a really feeling together, is a product of having acted together, experiencing something together. The second point, this is of course a Habermas notion, but in the making of participation, in realization of participation, you create the condition of the participation. The process creates the condition of the ongoing process. That's why the demo, which you miss, you can only get when you try to do it. That's like learning direct democracy. It's not possible. You can't learn outside of the water how to swim. You have to go in. And that's also when you think people are not well informed, they have not enough knowledge. Then when you invite them to participate, they acquire this knowledge. They acquire the interest. But when you leave them out, why should they be interested? And the point is, when you create institutions where a small number of people can make all people decide, you create the process, the incentives, economic would say, that everybody has an interest to discuss with everybody, because everybody knows that everybody will decide. And that's the essential point which makes the big difference between agenda initiatives and real initiatives, that a small amount of people can provoke a national or a European decision, and by doing this they can enforce to the society a debate which the society perhaps does not want, or some people in the society does not want. And the debate is of course the condition but not the guarantee of a change. But when you can't debate something because some questions are excluded, then you will never get a change in this topic. So the public spheres you miss, you get when you let people participate. And this you can even see in the past when the Danes or the Irish, they decided, everybody started to discuss and look to the Danes and decide how they decide. But when you think this on the European level, you can imagine the potential you would get as a public sphere on the European level. Not in the sense that everybody would look to the same TV, to the same papers, but in all TVs and in all papers you would have much more the European topics which are on the agenda. And when you look now to the design, where you have to be very careful, what elements of the design will decide if you get these needs or if you get what would be very helpful, then I think you can say you need you have to pay attention to 5 central elements. One is that the entrance, the door, which you have to go through in order to trigger the process, to launch the process, should not be more than 3%. In the canton of Zurich, where in the constitution I was very active, we have less than 1%. But this is perhaps extreme, Mr. Kirchgessner would say. And in California you had 5%. So somewhere in between, but not more than 5. Why? And this was exactly also already said by Mr. Brons. When you have an instrument where only powerful people can make use of it, you lose the beauty of the instrument. The instrument was created in the French Revolution and afterwards concurred in some countries in order to make the powerful change, in order to limit their power. But so you have to make an instrument handleable for those who have not a lot of power, and not making another privilege of the power, but to create it as a counterpower instrument. Of course, those who have power, they don't like you to do this. That's why you will never get more democracy or direct democracy waiting at home that it comes by mail. But when you make a movement where those who have today too much power, they are afraid that they will lose all the power when they don't share their power, which they have too much, then you will get it. So you need an activation. You don't get it by passivation. The second point, and this you can learn from the Italian, but not only Italian, the whole Weimar history is full of this. When you have quoras, that means minimal participation and approval requirements. This is an invitation not to communicate, not to convince, because then you know that when people don't hear about it, and they don't hear about it when you don't communicate, then you will win. That's like in the football, you get a goal when you make a foul and not a red card. So you have to know the theory of the system in order to design it, because when you implement elements which are against the basic concept, you get dysfunction, and that's why in Italy so many people are frustrated. We heard it this morning that half of the decisions were non-valid because although we get 90% majorities, Berlusconi said stay at home, so they don't get 50% participation. The whole thing was for nothing. The third point, which perhaps is less known, but you can learn when you compare American systems with European systems, the interface between indirect democracy and direct democracy is essential. You need an interaction and not an opposition. You need interaction, cooperation, and not antagonism. And that's why you have in the Swiss cantons, you have the best symmetry in the sense that when the parliament makes a law, the citizens are invited not only to say yes or no, but even to make a counter proposal. And since 100 years, the parliament has the right to make a counter proposal to citizen initiative. And then the citizens, all the citizens have the choice between three options: nothing, this way or that way. And you have even the possibility to say what you prefer when both change options would get the majority. The fourth element is also extremely underestimated, but you need another time notion in direct democracy than the economic time notion. Because the faster something has to be done, the more exclusive it will be done. And when you want to be inclusive in the sense of letting people participate, you have to defend an own time notion. That's why direct democracy is not fast food or quick fix. It's a 3-4 years experience. It's a 3-4 years process. And this time you need to defend when you want to get the inclusiveness. And in this way, it's also not true what was even said this morning by those who defended the instrument. That's clear how it will be the outcome. Because when you invite people to come along on a process, they will change their minds. They will make up their minds. And they will perhaps show a position you don't know from the beginning, because it's a process and not just a photograph of what is. And the last point, which you can learn more from the States than from European, but which is extremely important on the European level, you need fairness and opportunity rules. And fairness rules also means that you need, on the European level, vouchers, for instance, for translation, for trips, for meeting, that enable also, so to say, poor organisations to use this instrument to prevent that you create an instrument which is again a privilege of those who have already a lot of power. Thank you very much. That was in 20 minutes what normally I have a half a year to explain, but I can also do a little bit more if you like in the debate. Thank you.
Definitely, just give us a chance to ask questions. But I'm really convinced that you were so inspiring for all of us who are in the room, that I'm sure that you will get questions and comments not only from two of us, but I'm happy to greet my colleague Mr. Bronx, who has been also arrived, and let's hope that my other colleagues will come as well. But you should know that the delegation of AFCO by the chair Cassini left to Paris, so that's why some of my colleagues cannot be here. Thank you very much. So give us a chance to think furthermore, and I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nadia Braun-Binder, Academy for Administrative Science from Speyer. Of course, you are more than welcome, and of course, if it's 20 minutes, it's fine with you. Then, of course, we have the similar treatment, and let's have some chance for us to have a real debate. And of course, I'm very thankful that for the morning session, our great panelists are also here to listen to us.
Sehr geehrte Frau Vorsitzende.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour for me to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation. Just before I start my presentation, I'd just like to say a couple of words about myself. I'm a Swiss citizen and for 10 years worked as a lawyer in the Swiss Federal Chancellery. I was responsible inter alia for motions for motions for initiatives and referenda, and the carrying out of national referendums. I'm going to speak in that capacity, or that former capacity, to you today. But actually for a year now I've been working as an academic in the University of Speyer in Germany. As we've heard, classic instruments in direct democracy are popular initiatives, motions for referenda, mandatory referendums, and obviously plebiscites. Now, all of these instruments, which are part of direct democracy, are found in the Swiss system. But quite apart from the state-level instruments, these are also instruments that are being thought of at an EU level. And I think it goes without saying that state-level instruments couldn't just be brought in at a supranational level without further accommodation. There would have to be some modification made to them. But I think our experience has shown that there may be much to be gained from these things. Now, I'd like to explain what happens in the Swiss process to you by means of some examples, and give you a feeling of what it's like to live and work in a country where there is direct democracy. I'd like to concentrate on the experience from the administration side when it comes to the implementation of initiatives and referenda and plebiscites, etc. So first of all, you've got the possibility of an optional referendum. What happens if in Switzerland you manage to get 50,000 people entitled to vote to sign? You can then ask for an optional referendum together. Now, what happens with those 50,000 signatures? The Chancellery, the Federal Chancellery, counts and checks the signatures. That check concentrates on two main aspects. First of all, there is a control as to whether the local authorities have done their work correctly. The local authorities must, in the case of every signature, confirm that this is a signature of a person who is entitled to vote, and that that person has not already signed the initiative previously. The second step within the Federal Chancellery when it comes to checks is a check on whether a person hasn't actually put their signature down into separate local authorities. It may well be that during the time when signatures have been collected, the person has moved house, and it's very difficult then to check whether that person hasn't already signed. So you need this two-stage control. The signatures are then counted, and it may well be that some of them are deemed to be inadmissible at that point. The rules for counting are very simple. It goes very quickly, but if it's tight, as you can imagine, there may just be 7 too few or 10 over the threshold. Then it requires an independent count, a secondary count, and that actually is very rare that happens. The checks and the counting are one of the major challenges that we face in practice, and it happens under huge time pressure. Usually the referendum is submitted, and often the work to carry out the checks has to take place in a single weekend. That is because these optional referenda may be appended to a plebiscite, and that may then mean that the particular law cannot come into force. So the uncertain legal base needs to be clarified in these instances as soon as possible. The second instance I'd like to explain to you is what happens at the start of a popular initiative. Now, with a popular initiative, you can have a change or addition to the constitution. This could be a specific piece of text, or it could be something slightly more general. before you get a popular initiative underway, there are a number of steps that must be gone through, and once again, focus is initially concentrated on what the authorities are doing, the administration. The initiative text is obviously to be put together by those that initiate it, not by the authorities, but the text from the very start is translated into all the official languages, and it's the Federal Chancellery that takes that job on its shoulders. It's important to have these official translations from the very outset, because if the initiative is successful, that may mean that that initiative text is actually taken into the Constitution, lock, stock and barrel, the exact words, and all language versions have the same force in law. It's essential, therefore, that these official language versions are congruent and that there is no scope for interpretation between, for example, the French and the Italian versions or the German version. The drafting of the initiative text itself, as I've said, is up to those that initiate the process rather than the authorities. But what happens in practice is that those that initiate it start with a constitutional text. They have an idea, but when it comes down to it, they get a bit uncertain as to quite how the wording needs to be drafted. And what happens time and again is that they approach the authorities asking whether the authorities might be able to make a recommendation. Now, this is very sensitive indeed. The authorities may not make any form of recommendation in Switzerland, even if it's neutral. At no point may the impression be created that the authorities are behind the form of words chosen for an initiative text. What the authorities can do, obviously, is give formal impulses. They may tell you whether something should be expressed in Arabic or Roman numerals when you're trying to refer to a particular paragraph. That sort of technical help, but help with regard to the actual subject matter and the content may not be provided. Alongside the initiative text itself, you need a title. That's very important, and that also can be very sensitive, because certainly when you have a plebiscite, the initiative text is included word for word in the referendum, so it's very prominent. It's decided by those initiating it rather than by the authorities, but the authorities have to control that the title doesn't mislead, that it has no commercial or other form of advertising. It mustn't conceal some form of advertising in the guise of a popular initiative. It mustn't also give rise to any confusion or concerning a previously launched initiative. So these four criteria that I've mentioned relate to the title. That's then checked by the Federal Chancellery in their pre-examination checks, and it is only those criteria that they check against. The Federal Chancellery has to have submitted to it a declaration by the committee signed by all members that the committee members belong to the committee on a non-revocable basis. This is a critical point, because in the later process, if the initiative is successful, then the committee has a majority decision-making possibility to withdraw it, and then the decision as to whether it will fall has to fall, and so on, will depend on the majorities of the members. So those are the steps that the Federal Chancellery carries out. This is then expressed in a decree. If that all goes ahead, it's published in the official journal, and that's the starting point then to collect signatures. Now, a third example for today is the preparation and execution of a plebiscite. The authorities once again have an important job here. They need to inform those that are entitled to vote about what it's about ahead of time, and we've heard many times today that information is a key element. It must be well balanced, it must be factual and easily understood, and it must enable those that are entitled to vote to form an opinion and to make their decision. I would stress that